Alcatraz was one of the only prisons in the United States to provide inmates with a hot shower, for one disturbing reason, and we'll touch on this in more detail shortly. Alcatraz, one of the most infamous prisons in American history. Isolated in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, it once housed some of the country's most dangerous criminals, from Al Capone to Machine Gun Kelly. But what is behind the iconic stories of escape attempts and notorious inmates? What is the image behind the inescapable fortress? Alcatraz was a place of untold suffering, harsh conditions, and a prison system that often pushed men to their limits. These are the stark, gritty secrets of Alcatraz. Alcatraz Island is a small island located 1.25 miles off the coast of San Francisco, California. It's made up of about 22 acres of mostly rock with very little vegetation. In fact, a surveyor didn't believe the land was even suitable to build on in the first place. Because of its treacherous terrain, Alcatraz Island earned the nickname The Rock. However, the translation of Alcatraz is something far different. The island of Alcatraz was first discovered by Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala in 1775. Upon his arrival, he named the giant rock La Isla de los Alcatrazes, which translates to Island of the Pelicans. Over time, it was anglicized to Alcatraz. That's not the only thing that changed over time, though. Before Alcatraz Island belonged to the US, it was actually part of Mexico. Prior to the US-Mexican War in 1846 to 1848, San Francisco and its many islands were part of Mexico. It was only following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the two countries redrew their borders, that Alcatraz became a part of the modern United States of America. Around the same time, the California gold rush was underway, and the government decided to use the island to build a fortress for defense, thus creating Fort Alcatraz. It took about 9 years to complete, and by 1859, the base was fully equipped with some pretty serious firepower, ultimately making any attack on San Francisco pointless. During this time, the fort was also used to house military prisoners. One particular group of inmates were referred to as the Hopi Hostiles. The group of 19 indigenous men were sent to Alcatraz after opposing the government's forced education in boarding schools, which included policies that tried to eliminate their language and religion. The government thought the men could use some hard labor confinement in hopes it would eventually force them to submit. The Hopi Hostiles were held for 8 months in the military prison, and they resisted all forced government efforts the entire time, and even after they were released. Once the need for defense subsided, the fortress was mostly torn down, leaving only the foundation, and then for 2 years between 1909 and 1911, military prisoners were forced to build their new home, the United States Disciplinary Barracks. During World War I, Alcatraz started housing men who refused their mandatory conscription call. It also imprisoned Confederate sympathizers and privateers and various other prisoners of war. By 1933, the United States Department of Justice acquired the disciplinary barracks. The buildings were quickly modernized with updated security measures, and then the island officially became a maximum security federal prison. But not just any federal prison. Alcatraz was intended for prisoners who continuously caused trouble at other federal prisons. For most, it was assumed that once they would shape up, they'd be sent back to the federal prison they came from, but it ended up becoming a last resort for the worst criminals who had no hope of rehabilitation. Because of this, inmates at Alcatraz were not given sentences or planned releases. Their length of stay was determined by their behavior. Upon arrival, inmates were given a number that coincided with the order in which they arrived. For example, Al Capone, who arrived shortly after it opened in 1934, was known as Prisoner 85. While Robert Stroud, who arrived in 1942, was known as Prisoner 594. While Alcatraz was known to take those who were unwanted, there was one particular group that were not allowed in the facilities at all. The Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was strictly for men. Not only were there never any female prisoners, but there were never any female guards, administrators, or any other woman employed within the facilities. Many of the inmates went as long as 20 years without hearing a female voice, and that's not all they went without. Prisoners at Alcatraz were given monthly visitations, if approved by the warden, but these visitations had very strict rules. Not only was physical contact forbidden, so were certain topics of conversation. Visitations were closely monitored. Topics of conversation like current events or prison life were strictly prohibited. If these rules were broken, visitations were taken away immediately. and sometimes indefinitely. That wasn't the only way the warden kept a tight ship either. Many former prisoners reported Alcatraz conditions to be brutally inhumane, which severely tested their sanity. In fact, many inmates resorted to desperate attempts at ending their sentences early, and some causing serious harm to themselves after losing their minds. One particular inmate named Ruth Percival, who was known as one of the most dangerous criminals of his era, lost his marbles and chopped off his fingers with an axe he got a hold of from a fire truck. He then begged another inmate to do the same thing to his other hand. Later, he attacked an inmate using eyeglasses. He eventually lost his life in an attempted escape gone wrong. Some inmates went crazy and went at other inmates, and even some guards. Perhaps their fury was fueled by claustrophobia, given the tight conditions of their quarters. The basic prison cells were tiny, measuring only 9 feet by 5 feet. They were primitive and lacked privacy, but did include furnishings like a cot, a desk, a wash basin, and a toilet. However, fitting all of that into a closet-sized space left little to no room for the person who had to occupy it. Alcatraz Penitentiary was a 3-story cell house that included 4 main cell blocks, A block through D block, with the D block housing the worst criminals. There were 6 cells located at the end of D block that were referred to as the Hole, where problem inmates were sent for long periods of brutal punishments that often included severe beatings and starvation. D block became known as treatment block for some of the worst inmates who were subjected to varying degrees of punishment, including isolation, solitary, and strip. Inmates would typically spend between 3 to 19 days in solitary, where they had to eat their meals in the cells, were not allowed to work, and could only shower twice a week. That sounds bad, but it got worse. After an attempted escape in which inmate Arthur Doc Barker lost his life, security in D block was tightened, and some inmates then spent years in solitary confinement. This is also when the Hole was first introduced. A total of 5 cells made up the Hole. Inmates who were held there were only allowed 1 10-minute shower and 1 hour of exercise in the yard each week. The cells had nothing but a sink and a toilet. The walls were painted black, and there were no windows or openings in the door. At the end of these 5 cells was something even worse. The worst cell was the final cell, nicknamed the Oriental or strip cell. It had nothing but a hole in the floor to be used as a toilet, and prisoners were confined, unclothed, with nothing else for 2 full days, though former inmates claimed they spent weeks in the strip. The smell of these cells was said to be similar to that of an underground sewage system. Meals consisted of only a slice of bread, the walls and floors were constantly damp and cold, and inmates almost always ended up sick. After returning from the Hole, an inmate would then be tagged, which would ensure he was not allowed to leave his cell for 3 additional months. But the building included a lot more than just prison cells. The building also included the warden's office, a visitation room, a library, and a barbershop. A dining hall and kitchen were extended from the main building, with a small hospital located above the dining hall. Prisoners and guards ate 3 meals a day together, which were actually fairly decent. A typical breakfast menu at Alcatraz included assorted dry cereals, steamed whole wheat, a scrambled egg, milk, stewed fruit, toast, bread, and butter. While some of the prison's conditions were starkly inhumane, other aspects were said to be better than other federal prisons. When it came to dinner, inmates were allowed to eat as much as they wanted within 20 minutes, as long as there was no waste. Leftover food was reported as waste, and an inmate would lose privileges if they made a habit of it. This deal made with inmates did not exist at other federal prisons. The building's corridors were named after major US cities and streets like Broadway, Michigan Avenue, and Times Square, and while this may have been a small attempt at bringing outside life inside the prison walls, there was actually something much bigger going on outside. While Alcatraz may have been home to some of America's most dangerous men, it was also where the wives and children of the prison's guards lived too. At one point, the island housed 300 civilians, with about 50 families living there at any one time during its 29 years as a federal prison, and they did their best to make it as normal as possible for them. The families were provided with housing, as well as a bowling alley, a preschool, a soda shop, a post office, and a commissary for basic food items. Older kids were sent to school on the mainland and had to wear dog tags to prove their residence on the island. Because of its remote location, nearly all supplies had to be outsourced, including fresh drinking water. Nearly 1 million gallons of water were brought to the island each week, along with food, fuel, medical supplies, and whatever else was needed. In terms of security, aside from its treacherous surroundings, the building was equipped with metal detectors, state-of-the-art locking devices for cell doors, and new radio equipment. Plus, the grounds were still fully stocked with more than enough firearms for officers to help themselves to, if needed. In fact, the security of Alcatraz was so good that many refer to it as America's most secure prison. Prison operators believed it to be escape-proof, and considering the high security and the remote location surrounded by frigid waters and strong currents, it made sense to believe that an escape would be virtually impossible. And believe it or not, it was. Alcatraz was home to various prisoners for over 100 years, and yet no one had ever successfully escaped, at least not on record. Perhaps the perceived fear of massive man-eating sharks lurking the waters was enough to scare them into submission, which, as we'll see, was only one way that guards tricked inmates. In the 29 years as an official federal prison, there were 14 separate escape attempts involving 36 inmates. Some tried more than once. Of those, 23 of them were recaptured, 7 fatally shot, 3 succumbed to dangerous water. The remaining 5 were listed as missing and assumed to have also been lost at sea. Prison operators believed that if the inmates were accustomed to hot water, they'd be unable to handle the frigid waters they'd need to endure to escape. But there was one attempt that almost made it. In 1945, a clever inmate named John Giles did actually make it out of the prison by taking an army uniform from the laundry room and casually joining an army truck. At first he went unnoticed, and his plan was seemingly going to work, until the truck arrived at its destination. Giles' plan may have worked had the truck been headed for the city. Unfortunately for him, the truck was on its way to Angel Island, and as soon as he got off the truck, his identity was discovered and he was sent back to Alcatraz. But not all escape attempts made it outside the walls. The following year, in May 1946, a group of inmates hatched a plan to get the key into the recreation yard, take out the tower guards, and take captives to use as shields until they reached the docks. This incident was said to be the most violent escape attempt and was named the Battle of Alcatraz, sometimes also referred to as Alcatraz Blast Out. 6 prisoners of Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, Sam Shockley, Clarence Carnes, Marvin Hubbard, and Moran Thompson took control of the cell house by overpowering correctional officers and were able to enter the weapons room, where they then demanded keys to the outside recreation door. Their plan would have worked perfectly had it not been for one quick-thinking guard who quickly and secretly pocketed the key to the outer door. The inmates took the key ring and continued on with their mission, not knowing they weren't going to get very far. Their plan was to escape by boat from the dock, but when they got stuck at that last door, their plan immediately changed, and rather than give up and surrender, they decided to battle it out. The group took 2 guards captive, which included the one who safeguarded the final key. A bullet-infused battle began, and sadly, both guards lost their lives. Not long into the battle, 3 of the 6 inmates, Shockley, Thompson, and Carnes, chose to retreat back to their cells, while 3 others, Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard, continued to fight. In the end, the U.S. Marines intervened, and the remaining 3 inmates were fatally taken down. In total, 2 guards lost their lives, and 17 others were injured. Shockley, Thompson, and Carnes were tried in the deaths of the guards, with Shockley and Thompson sentenced to death by the gas chamber. Carnes, who was only 19 years old at the time, was given a second life sentence. While the Battle of Alcatraz was surely one for the books, it was not the most famous escape attempt. The next escape attempt happened in June of 1962, and this time, the inmates spent a great deal of time carefully planning. Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin learned of a 3-foot-wide, unguarded utility corridor behind their cells in cell block B. They created tools using a metal spoon soldered with silver from a dime and an electric drill improvised from a vacuum cleaner motor, and chiseled away at the salt-damaged concrete from around an air vent that led to this corridor. They purposely waited for the right opportunities to dig, such as during music hour when accordions would hide the noise. They also hid their progress behind fake walls in the back of their dark cells, which actually worked to fool guards. Once they dug through, they left papier-mâché dummies in their beds made with human hair that they took from the barbershop. But that's not the only thing they made. Over several weeks of planning, the inmates also made an inflatable raft from over 50 raincoats they slowly took over time without anyone noticing. They prepared it on top of the cell block and hid it from the guards using nothing more than sheets. Once they had everything in place, they made their escape through the vent in the roof, and believe it or not, they actually made it to the water. The 3 men are believed to have succumbed to the treacherous waters, but that's right, they were never caught, nor were they ever found. With extensive searches and barricades in place, the men nor their raft were ever seen again. The U.S. Marshal Service case file remains open and active to this day. Morris and the Anglin brothers are still on its wanted list. Their escape is known as the Great Escape of Alcatraz, but that's not what the reports say. Later in the early 2010s, circumstantial evidence surfaced that suggested the men had survived. However, this would tarnish the prison's reputation as being escape-proof, so the file continues to be investigated. Alcatraz's reputation was essential in controlling the inmates who resided there, and so, from very early on, it was known to be the toughest prison in the US, and considered to be the world's most fearsome prison of the day. This reputation was upheld by some of its more infamous prisoners who are known as America's most dangerous felons. Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, joined the others in 1942. He entered the prison system at the young age of 19, and unfortunately he never left. In fact, he spent 42 of his 54 years behind bars in solitary confinement. Stroud was originally apprehended for slaying several people, and then he continued his life of crime in lockup, where he took the life of a guard and got tangled up with many other inmates. He has been cited as one of the most notorious criminals of the United States. Henry Young was a convicted bank robber and serial slayer. He was also one of the many inmates who tried to escape Alcatraz in 1939. During his escape attempt with 4 other inmates, 2 of them were fatally shot, and the survivors, Young and Rufus McCain, were recaptured. They were both sent to solitary confinement for 3 years. When they finally re-entered the general population in 1942, Young took McCain's life as retribution for his time in solitary. Arthur Raymond Doc Barker was sent to Alcatraz in 1935 on conspiracy to kidnap charges. Barker was part of the group with Henry Young who attempted to escape, but unfortunately he was fatally shot by guards in the process. American gangster Al Capone, sometimes known as Scarface, arrived at Alcatraz a year prior in 1934. He was well known when he arrived, and it was immediately made known that he would not receive any preferential treatment. Capone was a master manipulator who successfully continued to run his crime business from behind bars when he was at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary by paying off guards. He only served 4 years at Alcatraz before he fell ill and was transferred elsewhere. Mickey Cohen was another infamous American gangster who ended up at Alcatraz for tax evasion, though he had a long list of other crimes under his belt too. Cohen became the only prisoner who was ever bailed out of Alcatraz. Alvin Francis Karpovich, also known as Creepy Karpis, was known for his sinister smile. He also went by Ray to his group members and was considered public enemy number 1 by the FBI. Karpis spent 26 years at Alcatraz, the longest of any prisoner there, for a multitude of slayings, abductions, and bank robberies. American gangster Machine Gun Kelly, formerly known as George Kelly Barnes, arrived at Alcatraz in 1934. His nickname came from his favorite firearm. He is best known for the snatching of oil tycoon and businessman Charles F. Urschel in 1933, where he and his group collected a $200,000 ransom, equivalent to $4.7 million today. In lockup, Kelly boasted about several robberies that he never actually committed, and the warden considered him a stand-up inmate. He was released back to Leavenworth Penitentiary in 1951, which was unusual for any inmate at Alcatraz. While there are dozens of other infamous criminals who graced the halls of Alcatraz, what these ruthless crooks did while in lockup is another story to tell. Alcatraz may have been known to house the worst of the worst, but their life wasn't all black holes and beatings. There was actually some fun too, like softball games for example. The inmates at Alcatraz were given yard time, and some of that included organized sports. However, the guards were in charge of organization, and as usual, they had ulterior motives. The softball teams were racially integrated, which often led to tensions among the participants. At one particular game in 1956, some of the inmates brought makeshift shivs and took their frustrations out on each other. Before long, the yard was a complete mess. That wasn't the only way inmates spent their time, though. Alcatraz allowed inmates few privileges, one of which included musical talent. Inmates were allowed to make and play music. Some of them, including Al Capone, formed a jailhouse band called the Rock Islanders. Apparently, Al Capone was able to play 500 songs and even wrote one called Madonna Mia. However, their time at Alcatraz was not all play. As similar to other lockups, inmates at Alcatraz were allowed to work. It was a privilege that was earned by good behavior, aside from the usual jobs like laundry, janitorial work, sewing, and woodwork. There was another job some might consider particularly disturbing. Prior to 1933, when Alcatraz was more of a minimum security military prison, some inmates were employed as babysitters for the children of the guards. These guys were called passmen, and they also performed cooking and cleaning duties for families. One inmate, known only as Mason, regularly babysat a 3-year-old boy. In fact, the jailbird actually accompanied the boy all over the island, as the young boy checked out the foghorns and watched for passing ferries. Around the same time, inmates and resident families often did things together. When the inmates were awarded special treatments like movie night, the families on the island joined them. This sometimes happened twice a week, with children perched at the inmates' feet for the show. It was quite an interesting circle of trust, but this strange integration quickly subsided after the building became a maximum security facility. And after 29 years with America's Most Wanted, things changed once again. With an intriguing timeline involving babysitter inmates to notorious serial slayers, it's often wondered why Alcatraz didn't last. And although many believe the Great Escape attempt in 1962 was the core reason, it was actually something a bit less dramatic. From the very beginning, engineers and construction crews warned of the challenging location. The rocky land and the surrounding ocean waters posed numerous risks, including deterioration from salt water. Over the course of its relatively short lifespan, the building deteriorated and crumbled. The plumbing, which was flushed with salt water, also broke down and gave off a strong stench. The building became heavily rusted, which posed a problem when it came to the integrity of the security systems. In fact, in 1935, shortly after it opened as a maximum security prison, the building shifted to within 2.5 feet of the edge of a cliff after a severe storm caused a landslide. It only got worse from there. Eventually, the government deemed the prison too expensive to keep. With the deteriorating building, along with the constant need to have supplies shipped to the island, the cost was too much. The prison was shut down, the inmates were sent elsewhere, and today Alcatraz stands as a museum. And while there are still residents living on the island, they're not who you may think. Without human inhabitants, Alcatraz Island has become home to over 5,000 birds from 9 different species, something the Birdman may be pleased to learn. However, some say the birds are not the only island inhabitants. Since its closure, Alcatraz has become a popular tourist attraction, with many visitors claiming the building is haunted. Claims of the haunted banjo of Al Capone, which he used to play as he feared for his safety. An inmate screaming in the night found the next morning with his sentence cut short. Ghosts of others seen during head counts. A haunted tourist trap is an odd, almost cutesy way to end the harsh reality of what was Alcatraz, which on name alone will always have its place in history, let alone the historic names it did carry in it. But even for a name as magnanimous as that, even the most secure prison in America had to eventually meet its own end. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more.